India has become the first nation to land a spacecraft on the south pole of the moon, just a few days after Russia's mission ended in a crash. This has ignited fresh conversation about a new space race. But unlike the one in the 60s, this race has new geopolitical goals, untested technical challenges, and for the first time, economic interests. We've gathered insights from key experts on this topic. Anu Oja, one of the directors of the UK Space Agency, Frank dwnews, European Space Agency astronaut and leader of the Low Earth Orbit Exploration Group, Tim Marshall, journalist and author of books like The Future of Geography, Alan Duffy, inaugural director of the Space Technology and Industry Institute, and Victoria Sampson of the Secure World Foundation, which promotes the peaceful use of space. So let's dive into what they had to say. Many have compared today's missions to the moon to the space race of the 60s. But of course, one of the key differences is that now there are more countries involved, like India. So what is the significance of India's mission to the moon?
They have had an active space program for some time now. They are more recent, obviously, than the US and Russia and China. But they've been around for a little while, and they have a different approach to how they do things. They pride themselves on doing things cheaper. And maybe it takes a little longer, but they are able to accomplish really highly technical results at a lower cost. But I think also there's an interest in being perceived as a major player in space. Again, not just for geopolitical reasons, but for commercial reasons. For the longest time, India's space agency had a really tight control on all space activities within India. And just recently, India opened it up to promote the commercial space sector within India. I honestly believe part of the reason why India signed the Artemis Accords is they're trying to position themselves so there is a commercial option then for resources on the moon, that they would have access to those possibilities. And again, these are very theoretical possibilities, but I think people are just looking at the long game here.
You've got to have enough money, you've got to have the scientific base, and India is brilliant, has great scientists, and then you have to have the geography, and you've got to have the willing, you've got to have the ambition, and India has that ambition, which is why they were able to launch Chandrayaan-3 all the way back in July 14th. Because they have the technological ability and the ambition. So actually that leads me to the big players. Clearly, China and the USA are out in front. Russia close to them, but possibly despite the moonshot, they're going to struggle to keep up. India possibly as a leading power in the second tier of powers. And within the second tier, there's a whole raft. There's Britain, France, Germany, Japan, UAE, Israel. But of that second tier, India is probably the one that is got its eye on the prizes.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of countries involved, but I wonder if we can really call it a moon race, because we have already been to the moon more than half a century ago. So what's all the fuss?
Indeed, we have been there more than half a century ago, but only in very specific locations around the lunar equator, actually. And here what we want to do is we want to go to the south pole of the moon, which is a total different area. You can understand in our planet Earth as well. We have total different areas on our planet, and it's not because you have visited one place that you know everything what there is to learn about our planet, and the same is true for the moon. In particular as well on the South Pole.
What we've discovered about the moon in the last 50 years, essentially since the Apollo missions and Neil Armstrong and his colleagues, is that there is water on the moon, potentially vast amounts of water ice in the South Pole. That water can be split into its component hydrogen and oxygen. That is rocket fuel. So it becomes both a resupply point for astronauts to drink that water, but also a refueling station for both our satellites and rockets near Earth, but also a launch pad to further exploration. That presence of water has essentially changed everything about our return to the moon. It's now being driven as much for profit through private companies being involved as it is for national or geostrategic acclaim.
Well, I mean, There's been research done that show like 19 countries have a moon mission planned in the next few years. And so there are a lot of countries looking into having some sort of moon mission. And I think there's a couple drivers for that, one of which is just national prestige. You know, it's exciting to be able to say, yes, we put something near the moon or on the moon. I think there is some positioning in terms of if there's ever any economic benefit to lunar resources, then I think countries want to try and have access to that. I will point out these are extremely theoretical right now. It's more the idea that should countries want to go further in the solar system, having access to resources on the moon is one major step for being able to achieve that goal.
The first space race, of course, was in a very different geopolitical world. So after the turmoil of World War II, what we saw arising was the competition between two competing political systems. And of course, our readers and our listeners in Germany will be very aware of this because they lived through the consequences directly for much of my childhood. I'm talking, of course, about the Cold War. And I think for both the Soviet Union and the United States, you know, the opportunity was there to showcase on a global platform their technological and therefore political superiority to the rest of the world.
If we define this as a second space race, are its drivers fundamentally the same as during the Cold War? So is it still a matter mostly of prestige and politics, just like in the space race of the 60s?
No, it's that's the big difference. I mean, there is prestige, as discussed, but the 60s was primarily driven by prestige, by one political system trying to prove to the world that it was the superior one. And that really isn't front and center now. There's an aspect of it, but it's peripheral. Now it's driven very strongly by two things: commerce and military. Commerce because there is possibly riches on the moon of the metals we need for 21st century technology on Earth in huge amounts. And of course, we're running out of opportunities down here and we're despoiling the planet. Now, the economic model is unsure. A lot of people could lose a lot of money trying to do it, but a lot of people are trying to do it. So there's the commercial aspect, and this is another difference, how much private enterprise is driving all this. But the other thing is the massive growth and importance of space to military. I could give you chapter and verse on the different ways in which it's important, but I'll just give one example. Russia invades Ukraine. It knocked out a large part of the Ukrainian internet. Elon Musk's SpaceX flew in lots of terminals into the parts of the country which the internet had gone down. Within a few days, had got them back up. So the internet's now running again, but the Ukrainian High Command now uses it to target Russian forces. Of course they do. Does that make that a legitimate military target? Elon Musk's Starlink. The Russians immediately began to try and dazzle all of the Starlink satellites, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. So that's an example of how it's central to warfare. So those are the two big differences.
Yeah. We mentioned Elon Musk's Starlink and SpaceX. How important are private companies in today's space politics?
The requirement in fuel to blast off from the Earth's surface, taking whatever cargo to orbit or to the moon, is extraordinarily expensive. A bottle of water, just a litre bottle of water, is essentially worth more than its weight in gold by the time you've taken it all the way to the moon. So it really is an expensive proposition, but if you can take that water from the moon itself, then that's a huge cost saving. It makes possible NASA's vision of Project Artemis going to the moon and beyond to Mars, but also for companies across the world. They see this as a potential to take that water and refuel satellites in orbit, extending lifetimes for these satellites from years to perhaps decades. And considering some of these satellites can be worth billions of dollars, that's a huge potential opportunity for those companies to realize. So we have the likes of Blue Origin, the billionaire Jeff Bezos of Amazon fame, essentially bankrolling that company, which now is able to demonstrate initial stages of lunar mining technologies. The likes of the mining giants in Australia, BHP and Rio Tinto, have come together in the Arose collaboration to share technologies that can go from the almost entirely automated mines of Western Australia and deploy that to the moon. And certainly at the speed of light, a mine in Australia is not so much closer a distance than the moon is from their remote operations centers in Perth. So we also, however, have a focus on sustainable mining. And by that I mean a focus on ensuring that we are not removing or providing visible damage, as it were, to the lunar surface visible from Earth.
The possibility of a moon base seems very far ahead in the future. What kind of time frame are we talking about here?
We really want to reach Mars one day, but I think there is a general consensus now around the world that in order to do that in a safe and sustainable manner, we first need to go back to the moon. And we get more and more innovation, ongoing innovation that also will be useful, of course, here for our work or what we need to do here on the planet and for life here on the planet. So I think we will see an acceleration, as we see already now, in the press at least, or in the media, there is an acceleration of moon exploration. But I think in practice as well, we will see it in the next 10 to 20 years. We will see a real acceleration of lunar activities.
Your approach to understanding politics, conflicts, and important events in general has been to focus on geography. And that's fascinating and a very interesting aspect on its own. But today we are focusing on space. So my question is, how does that apply to space? It doesn't seem directly related. Space seems mostly empty.
Oh, you say that. It is a little bit stretching a concept. I do accept that, but I also would argue, and I argue it in a book I wrote quite strongly, that I think if you do frame space as having a geography, then a lot of the things that people are trying to do become clearer, why they're trying to do it. So there's a geography to space on Earth, a geography of space politics on Earth. You are in a better position if you're a country that has a large body of water, preferably to its east, so you can launch more safely, or a huge desert. If you haven't, I mean, Belgium would really struggle, Switzerland would really struggle to be launching rockets for geographic reasons. If you're close to the equator, it's very helpful. You're getting a faster takeoff because you're launching the way the world is spinning. So there's that. And there's a whole lot more, including slingshotting around planets to get an acceleration, but I'll leave it with the moon. We've always been to the equator. It was easy to get there, easy to get back. We're now going to the south pole of the moon because that's where the water is. No one's ever been there before. And if there's enough water to make hydrogen, to make oxygen, we can have a base to then mine. And so again, there's a geography to the moon. So I do think it applies, even if it's a slight stretch.
Do you think that this could lead to conflict in space?
Well, I don't want to sound naive. The Outer Space Treaty does preclude military installations on the moon. And so you say, okay, well, if there's going to be activities on the moon, they should be civil or commercial in nature. They should not be military. So hopefully countries will continue to abide by the Outer Space Treaty. They mostly have. But again, I could see the concern might be, competition on Earth extends to competition in Earth orbit, which extends to competition on the moon. And so you can see if there's competition over landing sites or resources or what have you, then that possibly could bring conflict in space back down to conflict on Earth. Or that's going to be an interesting geopolitical conversation about, who gets to do what, who has access to the resources? Will there be competition over landing sites? Will there be coordination? I can definitely see a way in which competition on Earth extends to competition in space.
There's no doubt that the moon is now, or rather once again, the strategic high ground in both geopolitical competition, but also corporate. The ability to mine the moon, to use that as a base for science, for resource extraction, for prestige, makes that competition real, and unfortunately it is heating up. One thing that does play in the advantage, however, of our ability to safely and peaceably work on the moon is just the sheer challenge of the lunar environment. Even at the height of the Cold War, in space, in orbit, the Soviet Union and the USA were able to sign international treaties, reciprocal rights or repatriation of astronauts if they landed on their terrain, the ability to even dock spacecraft in orbit. All of those things happened at the height of the Cold War. So I don't think we should be so negative as to think that we couldn't do something as profound and cooperative on the lunar surface.
Now, the realities of today will not be the realities of tomorrow. Again, I cannot predict what the reality of tomorrow will be, unfortunately. But if you see where Europe was in the 40s with the Second World War, and if you see what Europe has become 60 years, 70 years later, I think we can always have hope that humanity will come together and that we will be able to achieve great things together.
I do not worry about this because, I mean, of course, there are geopolitical impacts and considerations, but ultimately that data is there for us as a species on this planet. And so while I recognize, and I think we need to work within the geopolitical constraints we have, and I totally respect the decisions that are made, I'm also a strong believer that even when you have the most challenging of circumstances, scientific exchange of data can act as a really valuable bridge. And as the conditions get more challenging, that becomes even more important. We saw this in the Cold War in the 1960s, and I think it's important to maintain now.